Good evening, everyone. This is the Black Post. Tonight, we will do our second rendition of Black History You Were Never Taught, Part 2. But before I jump the gun here, I would like to go back and show you exactly how we must start off and how we must. This is the Black Post. In the beginning, the Lord God formed man of dust of the ground and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and man became a living soul. God then planted a garden eastward in Eden, and there he put man who he had formed. These quotes, of course, are from the Bible and indicate that all men had a single point of origin. More contemporary sources seem to back up the biblical account. Roland Oliver, a former scholar of African history, noted that the first creature generally recognized as the ancestor of man was found between Ethiopia and what is now to be the Republic of South Africa, sometime between 1.5 million and 4 million years ago. However, up until the 1950s, many historians and archaeologists would not acknowledge mankind's African origin. Then came two foundings of great importance. A canyon leading into the Serengeti Plains in what is now northern Tanzania. The remains were found of a Homo erectus, a man lived about 1.5 million years ago. He or she was an ancestor of Black Africans. Now, recently, in the Washington Post reported another significant scientific finding based on DNA genetic studies. According to the article in the Washington Post, and this is back in 1997, analysis of patterns of variations in DNA suggested that all Caucasians and all non-Black derive from a common Black ancestral population in Northeast Africa. Let me say this again. Analysis of patterns of variations in DNA suggested that all Caucasians and all other non-Blacks derive from a common Black ancestral population in Northeast Africa. So are we the one accepts the origin of the creature of man in the Holy Scriptures, archaeologists' findings in Africa, or the scientists' DNA findings? It seems that all human life began in Africa, then migrated to Europe, Asia, the Americas, and every other nook and cranny on the planet. Humanity was born in Africa. All people ultimately are African. So are we fighting amongst ourselves? That may be the joke that we're living in today. The Great Pyramids. Most of these pyramids are in Egypt. See, the Egyptian pyramids hide many secrets and otherwise. Within the pyramids are traces of society, the long since passed into iniquity, along with mathematical and radical riddles that have never been solved. One secret of Khufu's Great Pyramids have been the racial identity of his builder. Khufu, the king of Egypt, who was called Cheops by the Greeks, was the architect builder of the Great Pyramids. He lived on the late 2600 BC. Obscured by time and historical omissions, few viewers of the Great Pyramids ever knew that his builder was a Black man. Scholars believe that he must have been a powerful ruler to have made his subjects build such a large pyramid in his honor. Now, according to the Afro-American Almanac, the Great Pyramid contains 2.5 million blocks of time-tested granite, with each block weighing 2.5 tons. This Great Pyramid covers more than a dozen acres of land. Scientists, engineers, and scholars are still struggling to determine how this feat was achieved without the benefit of advanced technology and machinery. I mean, granted, there's a lot of African descendant people, Black Americans, people originated from Africa. We can do a lot of great things with a little bit of nothing, okay? With a little bit of nothing. You heard it correctly. They most often assume that essentially the feat of the architect was achieved by a non-Black, but there is the possibility the modern DNA genetic testing could confirm the race of the Cheops, that the The great king of the pyramid builder was black. It's really hard to accept anytime a black person does anything of any great significance outside of entertainment and sports. And this is what we have essentially denominated ourselves into being when we don't know our history and when we don't speak up for ourselves about our history. Now, good old Abraham Lincoln, AKA the second black president, but we'll get into him. Don't take that the way I said it, but take it with a grain of salt nonetheless. Because the second black president of the United States, according to Rogers, was Abraham Lincoln. He was depicted as a Negro by his opponents and called Abraham Africanus the First. Why did Lincoln's political opponents call him an African? According to Rogers, the texture of his hair and skin color appeared to be more Negroid than Caucasian. See, his skin color was like of a mulatto. His black hair was coarse and he had brown eyes. These physical characteristics caused many to think it was possible that Lincoln had some black blood in his veins. Lincoln political enemies may have called him a Negro because they perceived him as sympathetic to the plight of Negroes and felt they could hurt him with the accusation. Now, ironically, Lincoln's interest was not in saving a black enslaved race. See, that wasn't his interest. That is what history books would like us to believe, but that is not the case. His interest was not in saving the black race, but saving the Union, which prospered through its exploitation of blacks. See, Rogers also says that Lincoln's vice president running mate, Hannibal Hammond, was a Negro. He stated that after Vice President Hamlin was elected to office, he was attacked on the Senate floor because of his dark skin color. Hamlin allegedly responded to his attacker saying, "I take my color from nature. You get yours from your brandy bottle. Which is more honorable?" Rogers quoted a newspaper editorial in the Chicago Democrat stating that blasting Lincoln with the possibility of dire effects of the country if a free Negro is elected to the vice presidency. R.B. Rhett, the secession leader of the political faction from Charlestown, South Carolina, said, "Hamlin is what we call a mulatto. He has black blood in him." Rhett quoted the same article in the Chicago Democrat, June 4th, 1861, which said, "The constant theme in the South for the last 2 months have been the elections of the abolitionist Lincoln and the free Negro Hamlin. Whether or not Hamlin was black or white remains unanswered. Either way, General Butler of the Union Army told the Secretary of War in the 1860s that in recruiting Negro troops, he would like to have a regiment of mulattoes about the complexion of Vice President Hamlin." Even back then, it didn't matter of the racism and the undermining if someone had darker skin, if they was having a tan or being in the sun. If you was anything close to being melanated, you were discriminated upon and you was exploded. Now, when it comes to Rome and the Catholic Church, there's some significant and pertinent information, even if you're not Catholic, that may just be good black history that most of us may not know of. See, Roman Catholic Church had 3 black popes that are not well known to modern day popes or even modern day Catholics. See, the Pope is the spiritual leader of the Roman Catholic Church, and from his seat of authority in Vatican Palace in Rome, Italy, the power of the Pope extends to all aspects of church affairs around the world. The Catholic Church is proud to state that unlike other positions of authority and leadership, the office of the Pope has continued unbroken since St. Peter venerated the first Pope. Now, it is commonly accepted that the Catholic Church has only elected white males to the papacy since St. Linus in 667 AD. But according to author Ross D. Brown, the Catholic Church has had at least 3 black popes and a number of black saints. The 3 black popes were St. Victor, Micheles, and St. Ulysses. How does the Catholic Church square the conflicting facts? They were one of the first religious denominations to recommend and sanction black enslavement back in 1445, contending that the blacks were inferior human beings, yet they had already elevated blacks to the infallibility of popehood and the high calling of sainthood? Was it because racism against blacks did not begin until the 15th century, again back in 1445, while black popes were elected to their positions centuries earlier? The Spirit of God works in very mysterious ways. Perhaps with these reasons in mind, while in Jamaica in 1992, Pope John issued an apology to the black race for the historical role that the Catholic Church played in the international enslavement and subordination of the black race. This is not widely known, and this is why it's important to understand, comprehend your history so you cannot be fooled. Now, growing up in the inner city, understanding who this guy is, Woodrow Wilson, there's a couple of high schools, there's a couple of middle schools named after him across the nation. But what we don't know about Woodrow Wilson is that he deceived black voters. See, Woodrow Wilson needed the black vote to win the presidency, the presidential election in 1912. In a formal statement to blacks, Wilson said he wished to see justice done to the colored people in every manner. Again, this was just to get the black vote. See, words without tangibles mean nothing. And not mere grudging justice, but justice with liberty and cordial good feelings. Wilson further stated, I want to assure them, the Negroes that is, that should I become president of the United States, they may count on me for absolute fair dealings, for everything by which I could assist in advancing the interests of their race in the United States. With such a public pronouncement, black leadership abandoned the Republican Party and rushed to support Wilson. W.E.B. Du Bois was one of the first to champion Wilson's candidacy. He was followed by other significant blacks during that time, like Booker T. Washington, the NAACP, the National Independent League, and the Colored National Democratic League. See, Black America responded to their leadership and gave Wilson their votes. There are 100,000 votes put Wilson over the top into the White House. After Wilson won the election, just like any other president after him, Congress drafted and sent to the president for his approval the greatest flood of new laws that discriminated against blacks that ever been introduced by the United States Congress. The proposed laws advocated segregation on public carriers, in hotels and workplaces, and total exclusions of blacks from the military and federal jobs. President Wilson thumbed his nose at black people and approved all of the proposed laws that propelled black people backwards. Conditions became unbearable in the South and triggered the great migration of blacks from the South to the large urban cities of the North between 1920 and 1930s. Wilson encouraged the rigid maintenance of Jim Crow segregation in every department of the federal government. In offices, the traditional hired blacks, the jobs were given to deserving white Democrats. Scores of blacks were summarily fired. Blacks were not allowed to compete economically. Throughout the South, abuse escalated. Lynching skyrocketed. Blacks, as well as their crops, were burned. Their animal stock poison and kerosene doused on their cotton. The little power or voice that blacks had was stripped from them. All sorts of schemes kept them from voting or having their cries of pain heard. While his black supporters were being killed and abused, President Wilson failed to issue a single word in their defense. Like so many great white leaders before him, President Woodrow Wilson became just another great deceiver. This is the usual case anytime blacks rally behind either a person who is in support of white supremacy, who may be in blackface. They're a supporter of white supremacy who may be in blackface and may be a black person, and or a white person that seems to speak to our interests, but never shows us tangibles, but never shows us action. This is the usual case. And this is not the unusual case of Benjamin Buttons, because we know exactly what this is. We continue to get fooled. We continue to get tricked, but nothing is new. Nothing is new. So where do I go from here? I think there's a lot that we can actually cover tonight. There's a lot of information that I would absolutely like to bestow on you guys, because Black history is just not talking about our great people who've done a great cause to the race, but calling out those who essentially put us back in a time where, as we were advancing, as we were progressing, they did and hinder our progression in the way they came about as thieves in the night. As thieves in the night. This is what we have to go about. Okay. Now, when we talk about another great story, a Black hero at Bunker Hill, although the Black race was itself enslaved, free Blacks fought and died to help Americans' white colonists win their freedom. You understand what I'm saying? Although the Black race was itself enslaved, free Blacks fought and died to help white colonists win their freedom. So the likes of Peter Salem. Peter Salem from Massachusetts, along with several other free Black men, were among the Minutemen who launched the Revolutionary War at the Concord Bridge in April of 1775. A couple of months later, in June at Bunker Hill, Peter Salem fired the fatal shot that killed the British commander. Salem continued his efforts to free the nations from British rule, fighting in the battles of Saratoga and Stony Point. Free Blacks joined the revolutionary struggle to seek dual freedoms, first for the new nation, then for themselves and other members of the Black race. They hoped that helping the white colonists win their freedom from British economic bondage would translate into freedom for the Black race. They helped to win America's independence, but Black freedom did not come with victory. This is the usual case, ladies and gentlemen. This is nothing new. Have you noticed through time that those who are in support of white supremacy and those who are white supremacists, they use us like a washcloth? They use us for whatever use that we can essentially assist them in their mission, assist them in the point where they want to gain more power, position, and money. And then, just like a washcloth, just like a dirty cloth, just like a rag, they throw us away. Then they pick us back up when they need us again. That is the only time you see where whites are heavily getting behind Blacks for their own interests, like becoming presidents, becoming in positions of power. And most of this is usually either and or both politically and economically. Now, a lot of people are familiar with General Ulysses Grant, because even though he was a modest, self-made general, so to speak, General Grant of the Union Army generated a lot of gossip. Rumors charged Grant with being an anti-Semitic drunkard and slaveholder who used the government for nepotism. Some of the charges were true, some were not. It is true that in 1862, he ordered all Jews expelled from the U.S. Department of Treasury within 24 hours for violating every regulation of trade and department orders. It was true that he used government to bestow favors in his own family. He gave federal positions to 13 members of his family. In the racial matters, another accusation was true. Grant was a slaveholder who had voted for the Southern Democratic ticket and had married into a pro-Southern family. In 1858, General Grant bought a mulatto slave, William Jones, 35 years of age, but gave his freedom a year later, even though he could have sold Jones and recaptured his investment. Further, in hopes of holding the Union together, Grant did vote for Buchanan on the Southern Democratic ticket. Grant is equally guilty of the last accusation. He, in fact, did marry Julia Dent of St. Louis, who owned at least 3 slaves. Her family was pro-Southerner. Grant differed sharply with his father-in-law on slavery, and before the war, returned to his wife's slaves to her family. Although guilty on all 3 accounts, General Grant did demonstrate concern for the humanity of Black people and personally rejected their enslavement. But all the while, he was a walking contradiction. Because, again, on one hand, you vote for the South to win, even though you are a general in the Union Army. We understood that the rising of the Confederacy was to maintain slavery so they can stay rich and powerful. So this is a usual case that ever since the Civil War, in some form or fashion, foundational Black Americans has been going through this. Now, it doesn't matter if we have fought for this nation or not, because we have. Back in 1792, law barred Blacks from the military service. The Union would not have won the war without the aid and involvement of Blacks. White fears of arming Blacks kept them out of uniform for the first year, despite the eagerness of thousands of free Blacks to enlist. See, we thought if we fought, we would become free. So we were eager, we were ready, we were motivated. In April of 1861, the first Blacks were appointed commissioned officers in the Civil War by the Confederacy in Louisiana. By war's end, 93,000 Blacks served in the Confederate Army. However, in August of 1862, the Union need for more manpower dictated a need for a new public policy on Blacks in the military. Frederick Douglass and other prominent Blacks petitioned the Union government to give Blacks a chance to fight for their own freedom. Even though that was not what the war was about 200,000 Blacks fought in the Union Army and more than 65,000 were killed. There were 30,000 Blacks in the Union Navy, about a quarter of the total number of sailors. Blacks in blue took part in 499 military engagements, 39 of which were major battles. One of the first to act was Edward M. Stanton, Secretary of War, who authorized the military government to enlist Black ex-slaves in South Carolina. After the Emancipation Proclamation of 1863 authorized enlisting Blacks, the governor of Massachusetts moved to organize a Black regiment. The famous Massachusetts 54, swiftly thereafter, other states began to recruit Black soldiers, and in May of 1863, the federal government established a Bureau of Colored Troops to supervise their enlistment. By the end of the war, 1 soldier in 8 in the Union Army was Black. Now, what about an old racist poem that even during this time of war and Reconstruction, whether it be part of the Union or the Confederacy, people were still writing? It goes something like this. Sambo as a soldier, some tell us it's a burning shame to make the niggers fight, and that the trade of being killed belongs but to the white. But as for me upon my scowl, so liberal are we here, I'll let Sambo be murdered in place of myself on every day of the year. So hear me all boys and darlings, don't think I'm tipping your chaff. The right to be killed, I'll divide wide him and give him, the nigger, the largest half. This is how they do, and this is how they were, regardless of what we were fighting for, and that we was essentially fighting for them for, once again, for their own best interests. This is what we have continually have been through. But also, we have poems of our own that may not have been as well known as some of these white racist poems, but we had short poems, something that was on the post-Civil War that went a little bit like this. We ain't what we ought to be. We ain't what we want to be. We ain't what we gonna be, but thank God we ain't what we used to be. And he's talking about slaves. Now, a lot of us are unfamiliar, even though we believe that we know a lot about good old honest Abe. We don't know as much as we think we know. See, historically, facts suggest that President Lincoln was everything but great. He was everything but great, the great emancipator of Black slaves. See, during the early years of the Civil War, President Lincoln publicly claimed that he would not and could not free Black slaves. He even acknowledged that the Civil War was not about Black people, but about national unity. Lincoln was not passive in his support of slavery, even when Union commanders issued orders freeing slaves and capture Confederate territory. Lincoln blocked such orders at least twice. Lincoln's position was strengthened by the U.S. Congress in 1861 when it passed and referred to the states an amendment to the Constitution that guaranteed that Congress could never abolish Black slavery in America. Few Northern politicians had any interest in freeing Black slaves. They were concerned about breaking the wealth and political power base of the South. Most politicians knew that Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation was a sham. Lincoln was president of the Union only. He could not and did not free Black slaves. See, the Emancipation Proclamation spoke gloriously about freeing slaves in the Deep South, over which the Union had no authority. Yet it ignored Blacks in the border states over which Lincoln did have authority. The attitude of Lincoln and his administration put Lincoln's letter of December 22nd, 1860 to the Alexander Stephens, soon to become vice president of the Confederacy. Do the people of the South really entertain fears that a Republican administrator would directly or indirectly interfere with the slave or with them about the slaves? If they do, I wish to assure you, at once a friend and still I hope not an enemy, that there is no more danger in this respect than it was in the days of Washington. Now, even the British press regarded the Emancipation Proclamation as sheer hypocrisy. The Times of London sarcastically remarked that Lincoln, considering himself a sort of moral American pope, he has no power. Mr. Lincoln will set the Negroes free. Where he retains power, he will consider them as slaves. Lincoln died holding the same views about Blacks that he held firmly throughout his public life. And that's the one thing that we really need to understand and come to grips with. Lincoln was looking at the self-interest of himself and of the Union. He understood that if he can join the Union with the Confederate, that he would be ultimately powerful and be in charge of the entire United States instead of having a separate union. Somewhat on the lines how they combine Rome and Vatican, but that's for a different time. But nonetheless, this is what some of the actually people went to. And that's what we need to totally understand, that they had slaves in the North, even while Lincoln, the hypocrisy in this, freed slaves in the Black, which he had no jurisdiction at the time. This is the great deceiver as well. One thing that's not being told is that the debt that Indians, aka Native Americans, own to Black people. See, in the early development of colonial America, Europeans included incentives to dissuade alliances between Blacks and Indians in nearly every Indian treaty. Culturally, politically, and economically, Indians were classified above Blacks. Many Indians adopted their racial attitudes that Blacks were inferior. Their skin color, the outward sign of their pristine status as slaves. There were major differences in the way Indians and Blacks were treated. The dominant white society felt a sense of indebtedness to Indians and taught them that they were superior to Blacks. Whites respected Indian heritage, culture, and religion. Therefore, it was accepted for Indians to assimilate with the white race, to become educated and farm the land. On the other hand, government treaties required Indians to aid in the captures of runaway slaves and to turn them over to local white authorities or owners. Like whites, Indians found slave trading to be extremely profitable. By the close of the 1700s, all five of the so-called civilized Indian societies were slave traders and owners and fought alongside the Southern Confederacy in the Civil War to maintain slavery. The degree of slave trading and ownership among Indians varied from tribe to tribe. The Cherokee, the Choctaw, the Chickasaw had the most anti-Black reputations. See, these figures tell a part of the story. In 1824, there were 1,277 Black slaves being held among 15,560 Cherokees. On the eve of the Civil War in 1861, the situation between Black and Indians had worsened. In that year, 25,000 Choctaw and Chickasaw Indians owned more than 5,000 Black slaves. The Chickasaw tribe offered the following explanation for supporting slavery and the Southern Confederacy during the Civil War. Our geographical position, our social and domestic institutions, our feelings and sympathies all attract us to our Southern friends. As a Southern people, we consider their cause our own. After the Southern Confederacy and the Indians lost the Civil War, neither Southern whites nor Indians wanted blacks to have their 40 acres and a mule. They didn't want us to have our 40 acres and a mule. 40 acres and a mule? No, we're not giving you 40 acres and a mule. Oh, no. We're not doing that. See, when the whites came over here, the European immigrants came over here, when the European murderers came over here, and they took our land and they gave our people diseases, and they essentially almost extinct our race and our different tribes. Instead of fighting them with the atrocities they have done to our people, if we can't beat them, let's just go ahead and join them. That is the method and strategy that these particular 5 Native American tribes use. Consequently, a committee of colored people of the Choctaw and Chickasaw Indian nations filed a letter of protest with the U.S. Senate and House of Representatives of the United States Congress in January of 1870. They argued that as ex-slaves of Indians, they were still being deprived of their rightful economic inheritance. In a treaty at Fort Smith, Arkansas in September of 1865, the Choctaws and Chickasaws were paid $300,000 by the U.S. government for a district of land west of the 98-degree longitude. The treaty provided that the United States government paid the Choctaw and Chickasaw legislators $300,000 plus 5% interest for the land contingent upon the Indian drafting laws and rules to free all their black slaves and give each black slave and their descendants 40 acres of land from each nation. In addition to the 80 acres to have been given to each slave, each tribe was to give each slave $1 per capita. The treaty further stipulated that should be Indian legislators not crafted these laws for black slaves within a 2-year time period from the ratification of the treaty. The $300,000 shall cease to be held in trust for the Indians and given instead to the black ex-slaves. See, this is one of the most unknown, unpopular stories that Native Americans have stole from us as well. And essentially, the government has given them some form of reparations for us, which they shouldn't have not have done, but nonetheless, that occurred, and they still did not give it to us. See, a contingency of ex-slaves traveled to Washington, D.C. in the early 1870s and complained to Congress that they never received the 80 acres of land nor the monies. They never received the land or the money. More than a century later, blacks are still awaiting to collect from their Indian slave masters. See, people would not like to talk about that Choctaws and Chickasaw were some of the most anti-black racist Native American tribes towards us during those times. And when given the chance by the federal government to give us money and as well as land, our 40 acres, they didn't. And of course, the federal government did not care. What was given, what was given, what was taken, what was taken. And we were still left destitute, poor, and homeless. This is the second version of Black history that you were never taught. Hopefully, you learned something new. Hopefully, you gained some sort of perspective. And hopefully, I brought something different to your dinner table. This is a Black Post. No matter if you loved it or hated it, the message was sent. The Black Post, the message has been delivered. You guys have a great and wonderful night.